pleasure to be here. I am Bobby Clark, and I'm an agent. I serve 5 counties in the Northern Valley: Shenandoah, Page, Clark, Frederick, and Warren. And my job today is to talk to you about hay and silage quality in a Graze 300 system. And if you will, if you happen to be one of these farmers, or if you're thinking about being a farmer that's really going to extend your grazing season, then some might think, well, geez, just for 65 days, I probably can get by with just about anything. Well, the reality is we still need really good quality hay. And John, can you give me a up or down if I need to hold the mic closer or whatever? I'm good? All right. So let's jump right on into some conversation about what is Graze 300 and a little bit about hay quality, silage quality in this kind of system. So the mission statement of Graze 300 is to enable farmers to achieve 300 days of livestock grazing by facilitating better pasture management and environmental stewardship. Now, this is not a one-size-fits-all program. Across the state, I might have one farmer that's all cool season grasses, and that'll probably dominate the average farmer. Just 100% cool season grasses, and we're grazing. There may be another person, and I understand that there's quite a bit of it around this part of the country, that has a bunch of cool season grasses but grazes some summer annuals and winter annuals on some lesser crop ground or something. And there may be some part of the state, it's not up here, but maybe somebody has half of their land is in cool season grasses and another half is in Bermuda grass. And they make it work for them that way. So there's all kind of ways of doing it. And then there's some farmers who might not extend their grazing season at all. And we still work with them the same. And there's nothing magical about 300 days. For some of you folks, the sweet spot might be 260 or 280 days. And for others, they just bound to determine to see if they can make it to 325, and they're just going to do everything they can to get there, or to graze a herd all year round for a year or two, just to see if they can do it. So there's nothing magical about 300 days. It's just a kind of a target and something that hope to get folks to think about, could I make more money if I extend my grazing season further than I'm currently extending it? So that's kind of the goal here. In the Northern Valley, for several years, I've done some surveys. One of these was done by another agent, but I've just looked at this thing about how many days are farmers grazing or feeding hay. I've done this for quite a while. And this is also kind of showing that I've been really thinking about this, and I really didn't jump and really focus on it till about 4 years ago. Prior to that, I was working on how to compost dead cows and slugs in corn and soil nitrate testing in corn and some other things. So I shifted back to this about 4 years ago. But you can see we're averaging about 220 days of grazing in the Northern Valley, and that's probably not changed a whole lot in the last 5-8 years. A little bit, but not a lot. So my first key point to make here is that extending the grazing season will likely be more economical on many farms. And mostly I'm talking about cow-calf farms. I know that there's a lot of horse people that can extend the grazing season, and good for them, and sheep and goat folks, but I'm mostly looking at cow-calf operations here. John mentioned Greg Halick has a lot of really good data on what the sweet spot is, and mentioned that it's about grazing 300 days. That information is for the average farm. It's great information, and the average farm is a good thing. But one of the things that we've done here in Virginia is say, geez, how many of you in here think you're the average farm? You're just about average. Probably nobody. Everybody has a different setup. I talked to a farmer up in Shenandoah County that said, we have cattle on 12 different pieces of land, and they're all not that big. And the next person down the road will have 300 contiguous acres, and good for them. But no one is average. And so we've decided to go around and say, sit down with individual farmers and run the numbers on individual farms and see if it is best for them on their situation. And I got 4 of these just in summary to show. The first, so farm number 1, this farmer, his current scenario was that he's grazing about 221 days, and he had 300 cows, and he was making hay on his farm. That's the summary of the operation. And he said, well, geez, what if I switch to getting up to 305 days of grazing? I keep my 310 cows, but I'm not going to bale any more hay. And I think he was selling hay machinery and just buy all his hay. And it would have, according to what we think the numbers look like, improved his profitability up to a positive $165 a cow. That's the improvement. And you can see how it was going to affect his bottom line over there. That's pretty dramatic. I think like this is probably as good as it gets. I'm going to make an assumption. This was not my study, but he probably sold some hay machinery in here, and that's what made this so good. That'd be my guesstimation. The next farmer was grazing about 185 days, had 160 cows making hay, and he was going to go to the 305 days, or really extend his grazing season. And I presume also that he was going to quit making hay and just graze the hay acres and do some stockpiling, but it would only improve him $42 a cow for some reason, not 165, but again, an improvement. The third farmer, this one is really interesting to me. Grazed 230 days was what he's doing normally, 205 cows, bale some hay and limited managed grazing. And he was going to go to 300 days grazing. He's going to cut his cow numbers by 55 cows. How many of you are brave enough to do that? That's quite the change. Because everybody's scared of the gross revenue they'll lose by cutting cow numbers. This person was going to cut their cow numbers and go to purchasing hay, but really extend their grazing season. It was going to improve him $43 a cow. Now this is where everybody says, well, you got to watch that cow number, because what about overall gross revenue? And it did show he was going to drop from $26,300 return to land and labor down to $25,895. Well, that's about a $500 drop. So it was less total or net revenue, $500. I would guesstimate that the real sweet spot here was probably 155, 160 cows. Maybe feed a little bit more hay, have a few more extra cows. There was probably a sweet spot. Now, again, I did not do these numbers here. A little bit more cows and probably would have been a little bit more profitable. But that's still really impressive to think about cutting back that number of cows, having that many less cows to deal with, less bulls, less hassle, a lot less things to deal with. Now, I know there's a couple agents that talk about the economics of truckload lots of cattle, and that may play into the factor. And I've had some folks, I'm not a cattleman, but they talk about having truckload lots and being able to get a little bit of premium for that. And that may be a case, and that I'm not sure if that was accounted for in here. But nonetheless, $43 improvement was impressive to me. And this third farmer, he was grazing already originally 265 days, had 40 cows, no managed grazing, just continuous grazing. There was some cross fencing, but truthfully all the gates were open, and they all had to go to this one pond or one stream for water. And that was his original scenario, but he was buying all his hay. And he was going to turn around and say, geez, I'm going to put in a nice managed grazing system. He was either participating with state or federal cost share, put the water troughs in, put a well in, do the good cross fencing, and really do that good managed grazing, which we know will improve his grass productivity. So he was like, should I add more cows, or should I just really extend my grazing season? That was his question. And so we ran the numbers. Adding 50 cows improved his profitability by about $54 a cow. But if he just extended the grazing season and stayed with 40 cows, it was going to improve it by $85 a cow. And you can see the resulting improvement in profitability. So staying with the same number of cows and increasing his grazing season, he was going to go from return to land and labor of $1,500 a year up to $4,900. It's like a $3,000 a year pay raise, which is pretty good, just for 40 cows. So it is what it is. So we know we can routinely extend the grazing season, 275, 325 days, and this will be more profitable on many farms. So that's the first little thing, my major point I wanted to make. Now, we have a bunch of agents across the state. We took farm enterprise budgets and tweaked them a little bit so that we can do this for any farm we want to do it on. So if you sit down and you say, geez, I want to think about this from a profit standpoint, there's plenty of agents that can sit down with you and run the numbers and help you compare different scenarios. More cows, less cows, bale hay, don't bale hay. Whatever is the scenario you want to, how you want to spin it, we can probably run some numbers economically and see if it's best on your farm. And I think that's the best way for everybody to do this, because there's no such thing as the average farmer. Here's my next major point. Most of the time, pastures meet the nutritional needs of livestock. Not all of the time, and not when you don't have any pasture to graze because it got too dry or something like that. There was some data out of West Virginia that was done in 1999 to 2001. They did a whole bunch of pasture samples, and it showed that 95% of the time, West Virginia pastures were above 11.6% crude protein. That's pretty good. It's a pretty good testament to how good their grass is. But and I know we're in the Piedmont now, and it may not be quite the same here as it would be in Wytheville, which is a whole lot like West Virginia. But this should apply. There's 11.2% protein, or whatever was that number, 11.6. I just arbitrarily put that line up there to kind of represent 11.6. And all these are different species of animals at different growth stages. Most cattle, a couple sheep numbers in there. But 11.6? Well, I done lost my number there. There it is, 11.6. 11.6% protein was above what all those different types of animals needed. There's dry cows, lactating cows, smaller heifers growing, 900-pound heifer nursing a calf that's trying to grow all at the same time. That's pretty good, isn't it? 95% of the time, pasture is good enough for all them things on a protein basis. On an energy basis, it's a little more confusing. 95% of the time, their West Virginia pastures were above 54.6% TDN, and only 60% of the time above 62% TDN. And when I put them lines up there, you can see that 95% of the time their pasture was good for a 1,200-pound dry cow, and for a gestating ewe, a dry cow being a cow in her last third of pregnancy. But when the cow's nursing and so forth, there were some times that the pasture wasn't good enough on an energy basis. But it's still, pastures are really good quality, especially when we start looking at hay. Here's some data that Matt Boer, an agent in Augusta County, put together, looking at how the pasture quality on, this is energy, on the top, the high blue bar is energy, the lower yellow bar is protein, and how the pasture quality changed. This was 10 Southern Shenandoah Valley farms, and how the pasture quality changed over time. I was actually surprised to see that the drop in protein occurred in June. I was expecting it to be on out here in July or August, but it seemed to have occurred in June. Still pretty good quality, but there was a little bit of a dip in there. Here's a pasture, so a few samples I've taken just to sort of drive home the point. 10.9% crude protein and 56.9% energy. This was stockpile grass that had started growing back in July and grew all fall and then got to November. That's part of the reason it started growing in July. There's a little more dead stuff in there than we would like. And that was really good in November, but what's it like when we get on out to January? And this is a farmer that's a fall calver, and the calves are nursing on these cows. And we were fearful that it may not quite be good enough, so he lightly grazed his stockpile fescue and tried to take the best and leave some just to keep the cows in a better plane of nutrition. Seemed to work out pretty good. they ended up grazing on this stuff about 60 to 90 days, something like that. It was long enough that you don't want cows to be under nutrition for that number of days. Here's a sample this last fall, 11% crude protein, 64% TDN. These are dry cows, I think younger, maybe still growing a little bit, but anyway, better than they need. Probably they were going to put on some flesh on this grass. Here's some other stockpile fescue. The strip is from strip grazing, and it showed 10.7% crude protein where we fertilized, and where we didn't, 8.4%. We got a little protein bump there. 8.4% isn't good enough. Probably, if you had 60, 80 days of this for your stockpile, you probably want to get some extra protein into them. Fortunately, we just, in this particular farm, only has that 8% protein probably isn't going to last those cattle 10 days. So he'll just blow through that and move on, and probably won't hurt them a bit. So the point of those slides is to brag about how good our pastures is, but also kind of say, we still need some good quality hay some of the time. Here's some data out of Virginia that Mark McCann and Dr. John Curran put together, and it was 61 hay samples from across the state. Probably a few of the agents in the room helped take these samples. I think I took a few of them. It shows that 97% of the time, our hay is good enough for mid-gestation cows, which are not, they may still be nursing a little bit, but the late gestation, it drops off a little bit in terms of their protein needs and energy needs. The big thing that they were really driving home with this data, this is just based on crude protein and energy, but when we take into account fiber intake levels, they were just jumping up and down and saying, geez, the cows just can't eat enough volume of hay to get what they need. And so a lot of them are below nutritional levels when the hay levels drop off. In terms of energy, our hay is only good enough energy half of the time. And if you look out here at a lactating cow, it's like only good enough 2% of the time. 98% of the time, our cattle, if they're nursing a calf, need extra energy. And you can see what happened to the protein bars also. So our hay over time traditionally has not been that good. And I think that's one of the reasons the Forage and Grassland Council is kind of focused on how do we make better hay, is so that we basically raise all these bars a little bit to make our hay better quality, which is important. But let's get back to the Graze 300 system and say, well, geez, if you're grazing 300 days, and that means 300 days the grass they're grazing is probably good enough, can we get by with lesser? And I would argue no. We still need really good quality hay when we're using a Graze 300 season. And so let's talk about some of those times. And we're all going to pretend we're Graze 300 farmers. And when do we need really good quality hay? Well, here might be one time. And this was taken like in March or so, or late February. We got some cows, and this was taken this past spring, coming off of this awful, awful, awful wet weather we had. I don't know if it was as wet down here as it was up in the valley. I think it was pretty well statewide. Pretty relentless mud. Little ice on the backs of them cows, muddy, wet, terrible conditions. They need really good nutrition in this situation. This is one of those times where you might put some really good hay in a hay ring and roll out some really bad hay somewhere just so they have somewhere to lay. Make them as comfortable as we can. Well, what about a fall calving cow? Do we have anybody in here calves in the fall? Anybody? Okay. Wonder how many of y'all calve in the fall. Some may do it for one reason or another, but some of you may do it because they're easier to breed in the wintertime, right? But the problem is that when you do that, if you're a Graze 300 farmer, you run out of grass probably sometime around February 1. And from February 1 to April 15, I got a cow standing there with a calf at its side. Cow's nursing the calf. She needs good nutrition right then. And I don't have any grass for them, unless you got some rye or something. But if you're just a a farmer who has nothing but cool season perennial grasses, you probably run out of grass most years during this time period. But you still need real good nutrition for that cow. 10 to 12% protein, 59 to 64% TDN. And I either want to get that out of my hay, or feed them corn silage, or feed them hay and get them some grain or something like that, right? So I got to have really good nutrition for those animals. And I'm a Graze 300 farmer in this scenario. So for farmers who are doing managed grazing, here again, we're pretending we're Graze 300 farmers, or we're really extending our grazing season. What do we recommend doing in Virginia when it doesn't rain for 40 to 60 days in July and August? Somebody tell me, what do we recommend doing? It's Extension's recommendation and lots of people. Feed hay. Pull them off of the grass. Just save it. Don't grub the grass into the ground, because we know it will recover faster when it finally rains. And so we put them in a sacrifice area and feed them hay, right? Well, what happens if you're a spring calving person? Now, if you're, I'm going to switch it around. If you're that fall calving person, and you calved and you weaned those calves off, you calved in the fall and you wean them off in April or May or something like that. In July and August, what's the state of your cattle? They're dry. They're dry cows. They're fat cattle? Well, they might get fat, but if you're going to feed them hay, they don't need quite as high a plane of nutrition. We still need some, but what happens if you're a spring calver? You got cows standing there with a calf at their side, and you're wanting to dry lot them, and you still need pretty good nutrition. So we recommend, that's my example of a sacrifice lot. Gabe hated this example, but I didn't have a better picture, so it's all better I could do. Sorry, Gabe. Cows that calved in March, 10.1% protein, 59% TDN. Something like that. They do need a little better hay, or they need something better to keep them nursing well. And depending on what time of year this is, I might be trying to get them cows bred back. I want to keep them on a good plane of nutrition, right? And so I'm sitting there saying, geez, I don't want to grub my grass in the ground, and I want to save my grass, so I want to feed hay, and I really want good hay to keep my cows moving along and keep the calf, keep my weaning weight up. What about the August and September nutrient needs of a 900-pound first calf heifer that's nursing a calf, and we're wanting her to grow and wanting her to nurse the calf and keep the calf healthy? Crude protein and energy needs are very high right then. And if I don't have any grass because of drought, I need some good quality hay, right? So hopefully Dr. Undersander will give us some great wisdom and help us find ways to improve our hay quality through haylage or hay or corn silage or whatever is the scenario. Additional situations when we need good quality hay. Early spring turnout, before or during turnout for diet transition, and we also know that turning out too early on grass can hurt its productivity. A lot of farmers up my way calve in March. If you calve a cow on March 1, when are you going to start getting really good grass to graze? I don't know how it would be. When do you start getting really good grass to graze around here? When is it? Early May, something like that. Some people think about April 15, but if you calve on March 1, early May is 60 days away. That's a long time. So I got to feed her pretty good between now and then, right? Bad winter weather, we already talked about that. Fall stockpile grass, tall fescue, it does decline in quality during the late winter months, okay? How many of y'all in here have a field that you would say is 90+% fescue, either the novel kind or something like that, okay? How many of us in reality have fields that are true mixes of fescue, orchard grass, bluegrass, and some clover? I mean, that are truly all mixed up, and you just can't call it one or the other. If you happen to have a mixed grass, we know the orchard grass and bluegrass and the clovers lose their quality way faster than the than the fescue does. So you can take that really good K31 field, whether it's novel or not, and you can hold it until January, and it holds its quality pretty good. But we know eventually the fescue starts to decline in quality. But we also know that that orchard grass and bluegrass, it starts declining probably right after frost. It doesn't fall off the cliff like really, really bad, but it declines in quality faster than fescue does. So even with stockpiled grass, as we get on into the winter, Christmas rolls around, and now here we are, January 20, these things start to decline in quality, and we either may need to supplement them or have some pretty good quality hay. At least we have to think about it and do some testing for it. So we've talked about how economical it is to graze, and we've talked about some quality things, but we also want to talk a little bit about hay storage and how important that is. So if we're all, again, let's pretend we're Graze 300 farmers and we're grazing somewhere close to 300 days, when is it that we normally feed hay? So Graze 300 typically by the book means that you tend to feed hay between February 1 and April 15, most years. So when you bale hay, when do we bale most of our hay? When's most of it baled around here? First cutting. May, hopefully. You're done by June 1. I asked this question of the last bunch, might show my age a little bit. Did anybody in here ever bale much hay as a kid on the 4th of July? Anybody? Maybe it's from where I was from. One person's going to finally admit to it. That's good. But where I grew up in Bath County, it was almost a tradition to bale hay on the 4th of July, first cutting. And you could go to the back of the hay bine and rake the seed off and sow them, and it would probably come up. That was that late. Maybe we didn't know any better, but that's the way it was. And there was a lot of people around me that there was a lot of first cutting hay baled at that time. And everybody has shifted to baling their first cuttings earlier. But if we bale hay in May and you're not going to feed it until February, that's 9 to 10 months in storage. We can experience a lot of losses in those 9 to 10 months if we don't store it well. That's a little different than if you're feeding hay 150, 60 days out of the year. If you routinely feed 150, 60 days, heck, you're probably feeding hay on December 1. That's 3 less months that hay sits in storage. So you could take some hay that maybe got baled maybe second, third cut, and heck, maybe it didn't sit in storage for 3 months and you're feeding it. But if you're a Graze 300 person, sometimes the hay sits in storage a lot longer. And so that does affect how we look at hay storage. So what happens when a Graze 300 farmer, we're just going to pretend that you're one of these Graze 300 farmers and you have a good relationship with a neighbor down the road and you routinely buy hay for him. And so one year you go out and you buy 80 days worth of hay on June 1 and you get it all home and it starts to rain and it rains really good the rest of the summer. Perfect rainfalls all the time. And it just rains and rains and rains, just like you want it to. And on October 1 or thereabouts, what would you guesstimate would be, how many days is that person probably going to graze the rest of the year? Somebody throw out a number. You're a Graze 300 farmer already, and you just got the perfect rain the rest of the summer. That person's probably going to end up grazing 325, 330, 340 days, something like that, aren't they? Because they normally do 300, and when it rains perfect, they really do well with their grazing. They got 80 days of hay worth in storage, and they really don't need it all. And so either what's going to happen is they either sell it or they sit there and watch it rot, or hopefully they've got it in good storage and can save it from one year to the next. And that's going to happen to that Graze 300 person. Now, if we get perfect rain in this region in the fall, how many other cattlemen are going to just be begging for hay at that time? Probably not many. I mean, everybody who has a little better pastures probably is doing well with their hay, and so they'll probably do better. Not everybody. You find somebody to sell it to. But the reality is in the Graze 300 system, if you when you get all your hay stored up just right, there's some years you're going to have carryover just the same. And it's really smart if you can have that hay stored well. Here's some data that was summarized from Iowa State. It's 13 different studies from across the United States looking at the losses that are incurred during hay storage. I don't intend for you to read all that. I just put it up there to show you that there's 13 different studies in this data set. The average losses after 6 months on bare ground with no cover averaged 27% loss in the summary of this study. I'm going to go back a little bit, and I'm going to quote you some numbers. This study was done in 93, this one in 92, this one in 96, 93, 81, 94, 2007. A couple of them don't have years on them. So this data is not ancient. It does have a little age on it, but it's not ancient data. If we put it on gravel or on pallets, if we put our hay on gravel or on pallets and do nothing else, it drops on average to 22%, so we get a 5% improvement. If I can cover the hay on gravel and pallets, it drops to 8%. If I put it on bare ground and just tarp it somehow, it drops to 13%, from 27 to 13%. If I can wrap it, it was 13. If I put it under roof or put it inside a building, it drops down to 5%. So storing the hay well really helps us out. Something I wanted to point out about the Graze 300 person. So I'm going to compare a couple farmers. If you're a farmer and you're normally grazing 220 days and you go to a Graze 300 system, if you make that change, you need a lot less hay, right? Let me see how to spin this. I had a good thing in mind. Let's just say you're a farmer and you normally in the wintertime you graze 220 days and then you feed the rest of the time, and it takes you 100 bales to make it through the winter. And you have 25 bales in a barn somewhere. You got a barn and you got 25 bales that you can put in that barn. What percentage of your hay is stored in a barn real good? Somebody throw that out there. 25%, right? Now, if that same farmer switches to Graze 300 and then he only needs 50 bales, just 50 bales versus 100 bales, and he can put 25% in the barn, or put 25 bales in a barn, how much has he got under in really good storage? Half. So sometimes I think if we extend our grazing season and we already got a little bit of that real good storage, it's such a high percentage of what we need that we may not actually need a fancier barn. We may be able to get by with what we got and not really have to add a lot more expense. I don't know that for a fact, just thinking. So here's another question. What happens in Virginia if we get no rain from mid-August through October, and we just don't have hardly any fall grass? My experience is that a traditional farmer is going to end up needing to feed more hay anyway. Somebody they're just going to end up feeding a few extra days, might be 30 extra days. Graze 300 farmers the same way. They're going to feed a few extra days, but I really don't think it's as bad as some make it out to be. I still really think it's important to have good hay on hand for the wintertime, no matter what kind of farmer you are, or you have to do some other things. If we have a bad drought in the fall and we don't have hardly any grazing, you can early wean and sell calves. You can sell cows if you just don't have the hay, or you can buy hay if you can find it. And a lot of farmers will have some extra hay stored away for bad droughts or really bad snowstorms. So just because I'm sitting here promoting the idea or thinking about the idea of really extending the grazing season doesn't mean that we don't need to think about really severe weather. If I were grazing 300 days a year routinely, I would really be fearful of going in the winter with only 60 days of hay on hand. I'd rather have 80, 90 days of hay on hand at least, just to make it through a really bad time. So back to my original points. Extending the grazing season will likely be more economical for many Virginia farms. So I want some folks to consider that. But we still need really good quality hay. And hopefully some of the things that Dr. Undersander and so forth are talking about will help you get there. We have about 30-some agents and several specialists across the state that are focused on this Graze 300 thing. And they're all here to help you. And I know there's several in this region that are here for that. You can reach out to them, and I know they'll work with you. And I cannot emphasize also that the cost share funds and the programs available through soil and water districts and USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service, are really essential to making Graze 300 work in terms of the water troughs and the water lines and that part of it. And I think, I don't look at these things as handouts. I look at them as the way farmers are doing good management on their farms to improve water quality, and we're doing our part to help the whole world, and we're actually doing more than our part when we install these systems for water quality. But these are very valuable programs that are essential to help make Graze 300 work. And the Virginia Forage and Grassland Council. I think where I'm standing, and I'm out of the Bay watershed, is that right? That's correct. And so, but up my way, the Bay Foundation also has some programs that help some people. So, with that, thank you. And if there's any questions, I can take them.